So my name is Rebecca Flores-Stella. I am the Assistant Director of Reliance and Regulatory Management. And today I am joined by my team members, Ryan Garcia and Gerard Aquino, both of whom are Senior IRB Analysts on the IRB Reliance team. And we wanted to just congratulate everyone um, on our progress as a research institute in spite of the challenges we have faced this year with funding, federal funding. We have seen an increase in the number of studies where UCLA is asked to serve as IRB of record with an associated processing of nearly 150 pSite submissions. So even though we have been challenged with current circumstances, our investigators continue to be recognized and awarded these multi-site grants, and that's just great news for UCLA, and we congratulate you. So today what we wanted to do, we wanted to provide an overview of responsibilities when UCLA serves as an IRB of record, and also hopefully to offer some helpful feedback and process review for when you find yourself in this situation. We will stop during the presentation at different time points to just ask for questions or open the floor for discussion. In the interim, if you have a question, you can use the chat or the Q&A feature of Zoom to post your question. And then Ryan and Gerard will be monitoring, and we can raise those questions at those different stopping points of our presentation. If you have something really urgent or a concept was confusing to you, feel free to interrupt me, and I'll be happy to address your question so that we can make sure that we're proceeding accordingly. So we want to start off with reviewing what is a single IRB requirement and why is it required? So while both DHSS and FDA regulations have always allowed for the designation of a single IRB to oversee multi-site collaborative research, the NIH SIRB mandate and the subsequent revisions to Code of Federal Regulations 45 CFR 46, also known as the Common Rule, require a single IRB review for federally funded cooperative research. We also anticipate the adoption of this SIRB mandate by the FDA in light of the 2016 21st Century Cures Act that seeks to alleviate the administrative burden that would help to accelerate the development and delivery of scientific breakthroughs. The use of a single IRB for multi-site studies is an effort to reduce duplicative IRB review with the same protocol, the same consent form by multiple sites. At UCLA, UCLA IRB may serve as the IRB of record for an investigator-initiated protocol in certain circumstances. So this slide just gives you the summary of the regulatory requirements related to SIRB for your reference. So the whole process of UCLA serving as an IRB of record includes 5 critical steps. First of all, there's a consultation with our office to confirm that Reliance is possible. Secondly, you have to obtain UCLA IRB approval for the conduct of your research at UCLA and for overseeing all collaborating sites, even if UCLA perhaps is not enrolling and they're just serving as the primary awardee or the data collection center. Then we have to establish a Reliance agreement. The next step after that is that we have to share the UCLA IRB approved materials with each collaborator at each participating site so they can consider whether or not they're comfortable relying on the UCLA IRB approval. And then finally, once we submit and review that site for activation by the UCLA IRB, each site needs to give us some documentation that their local IRB has accepted the conduct in the study per the UCLA approved protocol and the site-specific consent form. Now, the first step here is highlighted in orange, and that's to note that it's important that UCLA investigators not assume that UCLA will serve as IRB of record in all cases. This is true even if the UCLA is the primary recipient of a federal award. For this reason, it's extremely important that as the UCLA investigators develop multi-site research studies, they consult early on with OHRPP staff. This can be done easily through an email addressing the 4 points listed under step 1 here, citing the funding source, letting us know the size of the study by listing all the collaborating sites and their investigators, giving us a very brief description of activities to occur at that site, giving us a brief description of the study so we can make an assessment on the complexity, and then just if you have any information on the post-approval oversight program for your sites, that's also helpful. And you can direct this email to the administrator of the committee that would be responsible for the review of your study, or if you're unsure of which committee will oversee the approval process at UCLA, you can direct your email to irbReliance@research.ucla.edu. The Reliance team will identify the appropriate committee to which the new study will be referred to, and will work in collaboration with committee staff to complete your consult. It's extremely helpful if you're able to attach a copy of your funding proposal or scope of work for the research when requesting this consult, and we will respond in writing to you and provide you a summary of next steps. UCLA can serve as IRB of record or for federally funded non-exempt research for a study with fewer than 5 participating sites. This limit is important as it considers the limited resources UCLA has to monitor and manage all sites. For this reason, our preference is to review for sites that are AHRP accredited and hold an active federal-wide assurance. We can always consider other sites on a case-by-case basis. When considering whether UCLA IRB can accept the responsibility of the conduct of research at a non-UCLA site, we need to understand the resources in place at that site to support the team members in the event something goes wrong, considering the overall complexity of the protocol and the potential risk of participation. UCLA will also review federal regulatory oversight websites to note if that site has had any compliance issues in the past. So again, it's important to understand that UCLA is taking on a great responsibility and agreeing to serve as IRB of record for a site. So we're going to look to see if that site has a training program for its participating investigators. If they don't have a training program, will those investigators be willing to complete UCLA training or NIH Human Subjects Protection Principles training in order to confirm that they have knowledge sufficient to support the welfare of human subjects enrolled in the trial? Additionally, if that site doesn't have an IRB and there's not an Office of Research to kind of oversee conduct of research there, we would want to make sure that the protocol and the submission to UCLA details, what steps are in place for the UCLA investigator to be able to monitor progress of the study of that site on a timely basis, and what procedures are in place in the event that something were to go wrong. So we have to be responsible, so we have to make sure that each site can conduct that research at a level that would be acceptable to UCLA. So this slide provides us an overview of key terms related to Reliance. So we already have spoken a little bit about the term SIRB or single IRB. So this refers to the mandate that one ethical review for all sites participating in a multi-site or cooperative study be conducted. The reviewing IRB is the IRB that's going to be selected to complete the review of the parent study, but also the review of the activation of each participating site. These will include the initial review of the parent study, any modifications, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the presentation, but these include modifications that impact the overall study, as well as modifications that are specific to a particular site. Continuing review for the overall study, and evaluation of post-approval reports for the overall study. The relying IRB or institution is the institution that agrees to accept the determinations of the UCLA IRB. And as part of that agreement, they agree to conduct the study in accordance to the UCLA IRB protocol and if applicable, use the UCLA IRB approved consent form to enroll in consent subjects. As an IRB of record, UCLA is bound to ensure that the research will be carried out in compliance with all applicable regulations and is also in line with local requirements for each participating sites. So as we do conduct the review to activate a site, we collect information about their local policies, their local requirements, sometimes their state laws, if it's a site outside of California, to make sure that our review is compliant with all their local requirements. So the other thing we wanted to emphasize is not only is UCLA taking on a huge level of responsibility, but the UCLA investigator who serves as lead investigator also accepts a great amount of responsibility in carrying out a multi-site research. Accepting to serve as lead investigator for multi-site studies has significant responsibilities and expectations. The lead investigator is responsible for ensuring site investigators are notified of all UCLA's review determinations and communications, and those can apply at initial review, continuing review, amendments, and reportable events. That lead investigator is also responsible for promptly responding to questions or requests for information from each site investigator, the study teams, or the IRB's HRPPs at those relying institutions. So when somebody asks a question, how do we do this? Can we implement this? You have to have a point person on your team that can respond to those questions on a timely basis. The lead investigator is responsible for providing the site investigators with the IRB policies of the reviewing institution. So in this case, the UCLA IRB policies and procedures. We have each participating site sign a flex addendum agreement that states this and also includes a link to the UCLA IRB policies and procedures, and an acknowledgement in their signature acknowledges that they'll carry out the study in accordance with those policies and procedures. This includes, but isn't limited to, providing the policies to the investigator, and more importantly, to educate them on post-approval reporting, such as unanticipated problems, non-compliance, and subject complaints. The lead investigator is responsible for providing the participating sites with the IRB approved versions of all study documents, the protocol, the consent, recruitment materials, not the authorization form in most cases, because we don't serve as privacy board for sites that rely on us. The lead investigator is also responsible for properly reporting to the site investigator, the designee, any anticipated problems involving risk to subjects or others, or significant subject complaints that are related or may affect subjects participating in the research. It's important we apply UCLA policy to each participating site. So we use our UCLA reporting requirements to determine whether a PAR is required or whether it's an event that can be reported as part of your summary of deviations and non-reportable events that is submitted with your annual required continuing review. And that lead investigator is also responsible to obtain required information for the continuing review of the main study at UCLA. So your continuing review submission has to be comprehensive, and it has to have a means for collecting information from each participating site, so that when you summarize the conduct of the research, it includes information not only for UCLA enrollments, but for all participating sites. At this point, this kind of summarizes responsibilities related to serving as IRB of record. Are there any questions at this point? Okay, if not, then I'm going to continue on here.
Sorry, Rebecca.
Yes,
Sorry, this is Arshia. I know you mentioned a couple of things about the about the relying sites and doing the pSite application. Can you just reiterate the process of putting somebody on who is not at UCLA, who's at like another site? Who do we reach out to be able to pull them up on the
Mhm.
pSite application? Thank you.
Sure, sure, Arsha. We're gonna talk in detail about that pSite application later in the presentation, and Ryan will go over that.
Oh,
So
perfect.
Ryan, could you make a note about that? I think it's included on the slide, but if not, can you make a note on who they contact to add a non-UCLA investigator to our database? Thank you. Any other questions?
That's it. Thank you.
Okay, great, Arsha. So the second part of this process is obtaining UCLA IRB approval for the conduct of the research at UCLA if enrollments will occur at UCLA and for the overall study. So this is something you're going to be very familiar to. You have to do a new study submission in Bruin IRB, and that new study will be managed by the designated IRB committee staff that coordinates with the Reliance team. And basically, your committee is selected usually by the home department of your PI, but there may be some instances where perhaps your PI is doing um, more qualitative research or they're doing more biomedically based research study and they're usually doing more qualitative research. And so perhaps another committee will be more appropriate to review that. Um, your committee administrator, or if you're working with the Reliance team, will help to coordinate and to confirm which committee would be most appropriate to review your multi-site study. And this slide just kind of gives you a general definition of the areas that are covered by each board. UCLA IRB will review the study as normal through normal practices, and you'll work with your committee administrator, your committee analyst, as part of that review, responding to any questions from the UCLA IRB until you reach the point of approval, which will result in an approved study protocol and a consent form and other related study documents that will be available to share with the participating sites. That's important to understand. In order to agree to rely on the UCLA IRB approval, each participating site needs to have access to the study approval documents. They need to be able to look at the protocol and say, yes, we can conduct this study as UCLA has outlined. We have no concerns. One thing that we do recommend is being sure that we're going to generate all the documents that each participating site will need to have in order to make that decision. So, of course, they're going to need the UCLA IRB approval for the main study, the approved protocol, and also we recommend including any applicable appendices. So, as you know, our Bruin IRB application is pretty bare bones and it doesn't go into detail. It relies heavily on the uploaded protocol. Scientific protocols and grant submissions do not always cover um, information that's required to make the IRB review determinations. And so you are encouraged to populate the biomedical, if it's a biomedical study, protocol template or the social behavioral protocol template, and make sure items relating to recruitment, process of informed consent, or any unique procedures, special populations are populated, and then you can also provide that to a participating site. We are finding more and more that participating sites want to have more detailed documentation of the recruitment and the process of informed consent, particularly if you're doing online consent or you're doing a Zoom session for consent. They want to know the details of how that's going to happen and what securities are in place. In the same sense, if your protocol involves children and the IRB is going to have to make certain regulatory determinations and you complete that children's supplement, we would want to provide that to the participating sites. So as much as you are able, we encourage you to use those supplements to make sure you have the detail that your participating site may want in order to be able to accept the UCLA IRB review. The ones that raise the most questions most often are the recruitment and informed consent process, which you can just choose to complete, I believe, on the biomedical template, it's item 4 and 5 that detail that. On the social behavioral template, I'm not as familiar, so I don't know the numbers, but there is a specific section for recruitment and process of informed consent. We've also, when we grant waivers of informed consent for a study, the supplement outlining the justification for that waiver is very helpful to the participating sites. And they also tend to like the supplements for the enrollment of children and the required regulatory determinations for risk category and the requirement for parental permission and assent. So those are things that we have tended to receive more questions on, that we strongly encourage you to document in those supplements, because your scientific protocol or your grant submission protocol don't always cover those in detail. Very rarely do. They're also going to need the approved consent form or forms if there's multiple for your study. And they need to review those because they have to agree to use that, with the exception that they'll plug in some local site context that we'll talk a little bit more in a couple of slides. And then, if applicable, any recruitment materials. So you're going to go through the usual IRB review process, and then you're going to generate these materials. And again, with the mind that these materials will be the SOPs for your participating sites on how to carry out the studies. So documentation here is key. So that is so the UCLA IRB approval goes as normal. And are there any questions about that, or the submission of the main study to UCLA IRB, which would be this second step? Okay. Then the next part of this process is kind of interesting, because the establishment of a reliance agreement, the completion of the local context review at the local site, and the UCLA review and approval of the activation of each site as part of the pSite submission process are steps that are interrelated, and they address very important steps. One is confirming that UCLA IRB is accepted by each site to serve as IRB of record. Secondly, is establishing the required reliance agreement with each participating site, depending on whether they're smart IRB participants, whether they have an FWA, or if it's a community-based site or a community-based clinic, whether we have to develop an individual investigator agreement. And then we have to have the review of our information locally by that local site, and we'll talk a little bit about that. A pSite submission that uploads all this documentation for UCLA, and then UCLA's review and approval of that pSite and that related documentation that we agree the site may be activated at that site. As a final step, we need to know from the relying site that the way UCLA approved that site, the consent form, the protocol, is acceptable, and they agree to move forth with a study for that. So then at the very last step is the submission of documentation from that local site to let us know we're good to go and we accept what UCLA approved for our site. So this chart kind of breaks it down in more detail. In order to facilitate things, we try to start setting up and prepping for the eventual reliance agreement. So we will talk in a few slides about how you document reliance and how you identify both the institution as well as the investigator that will lead the study at that site, or the personnel who will lead the study at that site as part of your BU and IRB submission. The one thing that your BU and IRB submission doesn't include or doesn't request is that investigators and primary contacts email address. And that's why we have the pSite supplemental form, where we collect that information and we collect information about local site policies and procedures. And this will help us determine what kind of agreement we set up. So this slide goes in more detail about what I just summarized in the slide before. So when we serve as IRB reliance agreement, the primary reliance tool we use, or the primary reliance agreement we use, is the Smart IRB version 3.0. Because we are members of version 3.0, which was recently implemented in the last year, We can only use this agreement with other institutions that are also signatories on version 3.0 of the Smart IRB agreement. Most of our major collaborators have signed on. This is an agreement used by almost all academic medical centers in the United States, universities. Our previous agreements with UC campuses, the UC MOU, and then our CTSI partners with Cedars, Martin Luther King, Harbor, those have all transitioned into Smart IRB. So we follow the same process for all these collaborations, which makes it a bit easier. If for some reason the institution that you're working with is not on version 3.0 or they're not involved with Smart IRB at all, but they do have a federal-wide assurance, so they are authorized to be recipients of federal funds, we can do an IRB authorization agreement, which basically allows that institution to defer the requirement for IRB review to UCLA. In some cases, we work with community sites, community clinics, churches, community centers that don't have an IRB. They're not an established research institution. And so we enter into an agreement with an independent investigator rather than an institution. So, and we have that ability to do that. We would require that individual to meet UCLA training requirements. We would require we would work with the PI and that individual to outline a plan for study oversight and how often they'll check in and how they'll handle adverse events. So that's a little bit more involved, but we are able to do that. So these are the main ways we're able to serve and document Reliance for IRB of record. Now, just keep in mind the establishment of that Reliance agreement is one step. The approval of that site and activation of that site is a different step. So that's why it can get a little bit complicated and seem like once you sign the Reliance agreement, there's still steps that have to take place. The Reliance agreement simply documents that UCLA is willing to serve as IRB of record and that collaborator is willing to rely on UCLA's IRB review. It's a willingness. It's not an official okay to start. So we talked about the Bruin IRB application for your main study, and the best thing you can do is to make sure that you're documenting the study to reflect that this is a multi-site study, that it will not rely on an external IRB because UCLA will be the reviewing IRB. However, UCLA will serve as a single IRB for participating sites. So 6 has to be yes, and 4 has to indicate multi-site studies, and 5 should be no. And in addition, on item number 4 on the page, local UCLA study team members, you need to make sure you list the lead investigator for each collaborating center here, and you provide a brief description of what activities will be happening at that site. And we'll use this information as we enter into the Reliance agreement process to confirm that what's stated in our agreements matches what the IRB approved. On this side, I just wanted to give you a sense of how the Reliance team works with and collaborates with the committee review team. So obviously the committee review team is taking the lead and is responsible for the completion of the UCLA IRB review. What the committee team will do is upon receiving a study that's requesting for UCLA to serve as IRB of record, they'll provide an initial notification to the Reliance team. And then the Reliance team is able to look in your application, to see the sites, to see the investigators, to get a sense of the activities to be performed at that site. So we get a sense of what kind of agreements will be necessary. Do all sites need an agreement? Sometimes if a site is not deemed to be engaged in human subjects research, an agreement's not indicated. For sites that do need IRB oversight, we'll look up their AHRP status, if they are AHRP accredited, whether they participate in our preferred Smart IRB agreement. We also check to see if we have to add the site or the investigator related to the question that was brought up. If they're already in Bruin IRB, and if not, we'll communicate with you on how to get them into our database. And then we will determine how we're going to document Reliance, SMART IRB, IRB authorization agreement, or individual investigator agreement. The Reliance team will also provide instructions to the UCLA investigator and the study team regarding the required pSite submission. They'll provide the additional documents that need to be completed, which will be the pSite supplemental form. And if we're using SMART IRB, the SMART IRB Flex Addendum, which documents how we'll be communicating site to site. Once this main study is approved, the committee team will again contact the Reliance team, and they'll document in your Bruin IRB submission those sites for which UCLA IRB has granted approval to serve as IRB of record. This is kind of the handoff, the baton handoff to the Reliance team, and this is where our intensive work begins. We will then move forward with any agreements that we had previously identified that needed to be done. If we're using Smart IRB, we will either document it in the Smart IRB portal, create an application in there, or in IRX to notify each participating site that UCLA has agreed to serve as IRB of record, and now the ball's in their court to decide if they'll rely on UCLA. Based on our experience so far in the growing volume of situations where UCLA is being asked to serve as IRB of record, in the new year, we will probably begin to document Reliance more in IRX, which is a different portal to support nationwide Reliance. The reason for that is that not only can it document the agreement to rely like the Smart IRB system does, but it also helps to facilitate the sharing of documents in the future if there's modifications to the study, to share and distribute the annual continuing review notice, any determinations on PARs that may be affecting the study overall. So we feel like this will help facilitate your role as the local and lead site and helping to get these documents to the sites as soon as possible. So we'll talk more about that in the new year when we begin working with that system. And finally, the Reliance team is responsible for educating your investigator and you on the responsibilities related to the oversight of multi-site studies, and are available to do that with you. Any questions about this part of the process and the differences between what the Reliance team handles and the committee team handles?
So up until now, we've been making the submissions in the Smart IRB portal. We no longer have to do that from the study team side.
No, as we have had more and more and the volume has increased, there's a lot of times when you create the submissions where there's certain documents that aren't uploaded or sites aren't correctly entered or things like that. So we have found it works a little bit more swiftly if we do it, and then we're able to talk to, because the agreement is between IRB and IRB rather than investigator and investigator. So if we have questions or there's concerns from the other sites, we can address that in the portal much easier. So we have been setting up the Smart IRB submission for you and completing it and sending out that request to the participating sites to consider whether to rely on UCLA or not. You can do that. You have the capability to do that. But in most cases, we'll let you know that we'll take care of that submission for you.
Got it. Thanks.
So the next part of this becomes a local context review. And the local context review for each participating site, again, focuses on making sure that this study is being conducted or is able to be conducted in compliance with local policies and procedures. A huge portion of the local context review focuses on the consent form. So this is an important concept because in Reliance, in accepting to rely, that relying institution agrees to use the consent form as UCLA approved it because UCLA is releasing a regulatory compliant consent form. So we want to maintain the integrity of that consent form. So what that means is that there's only certain sections that we allow that relying site to edit. They can't wordsmith, they can't rephrase sentences that you wrote that they don't care for. They can't put in additional language that it's just a matter of personal preference. The areas that they're able to change are obviously the section for compensation for research injury, because each institution has a different policy. And they also are able to update any cost language related to how billing occurs for their site. Payment for their site, if the rates are different or they don't allow payment or they require payment, that can be changed as a local context issue. Local study team contacts, obviously, the local PI, the local IRB office information can be added there. And then any changes to address legal or regulatory issues. And this is most commonly related to state law. A good example of this is in the state of California and at UCLA, we do not allow inclusion of HIPAA-related information in our consent documents because we require the use of a separate research authorization forms. As you collaborate with different institutions in non-California states, that may change. We often have to approve a HIPAA appendix to the consent form for the state of Tennessee, because their HIPAA is addressed as part of their consent form. So those kinds of changes are acceptable because it's addressing state law. So that's what we mean about allowing changes to address legal or regulatory issues. And many of our collaborations are national. So as part of the information we collect from that pSite and that pSite supplemental form, they're telling us in the state of Tennessee, HIPAA has to be included and there has to be a signature for HIPAA authorization as well as consent. So when we're reviewing that pSite consent form, we're making sure that we're addressing those requirements. In the same sense, if we were collaborating with an institution that didn't allow for the inclusion of certain options as part of reproductive risk language, we would remove that and allow it for that institutional consent. Other than that, the consent should basically be a cookie cutter template for these participating sites. And the importance of maintaining the integrity of that consent is because as this consent changes, as the study progresses and we add risk or we add additional explanation related to confidentiality because of a HIPAA breach or something like that, we need to update the consents for each site. So if everybody has their own very different version of the consent form, it's going to be so time and staff intensive to make those edits. So we are very consistent and very strong in saying, no, these are the sections we allow. If you want to rely on us, that's what we'll approve. And so that's something just to, as you're working with your pSites and selecting those sites, make sure that they understand. And, these bullets are very helpful for saying these are the sections that UCLA will allow you to edit. And this is in line with the SMART IRB SOPs. Any questions on that consent form review at the local site? Okay. Then the next part of the local context review is that site has to tell us at their institution what other reviews, who else has to sign off on this study, and say that they tell us as part of their pSite supplemental form. And then this is why also we require a final statement from that site, either an acknowledgement notice. Some sites do it as an approval. Some site it's just an email to the investigator saying, you've addressed all local requirements. You're good to go at, University America, whatever site it is. And this is why when you get your pSite approval notice, in most cases, there's always going to be a condition saying UCLA's approved this site with this consent form. However, it's the relying investigator's responsibility to make sure that this study is activated in compliance with all local review and requirements. It's no subject, that's their responsibility. So until they do that at their site, they can enroll at their site. We're telling them you have to follow your local site policies and procedures. So once they get that final notice, and it can be in any form, again, some people have acknowledgement notices like we issue. Others have approval notices. Others don't issue a notice and they'll email the investigator. You would then upload that as a subsequent modification to the pSite to say they're good to go, they're completely active, and then we would remove any restrictions we had placed on your consent and release the stamp consents for those sites. We do have some sites that want the stamp consent form with our approval for the site. We don't release the consent forms routinely because we haven't gotten that final okay from the site. But if a site, their process requires that, all you need to do is to contact your Reliance analyst and say, this is their policy, and we will release it and put another condition on there so that it's clear they can enroll until we have the clearance from their site. All right, so at this point, if there's no questions on what I've presented about local site contacts, Ryan's going to move forward and talk about pSite submissions.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thanks,
These next
Ryan.
few slides are related to the creation of participating site submissions and how we process them, as well as how to navigate these submissions. Bruin IRB has a function to add relying sites participating in approved research when UCLA is serving as the IRB of record. This function, as you can see here in the slide, is called add participating sites and is present for PIs and PI proxies for studies that are approved with UCLA reviewing, so long as the application is indicated to be multi-site or collaborative and states that UCLA will serve as the IRB of record for other sites. When trying to create this submission, you'll be prompted to enter the relying investigator and their institution as a first step before it'll even create the submission. If you can't locate the relying investigator's profile or their institution in Bruin IRB, please reach out to the IRB Reliance team at irbreliance@research.ucla.edu with the relying PI's institution, name, working email, and the study that you're emailing us about, so that way we can reach out to the Bruin IRB team. And the IRB Reliance team will work with the Bruin IRB team to add the relying investigator and, if applicable, their institution to Bruin IRB to facilitate the creation of this participating site submission. Each participating site, or pSite as we tend to call them, will be created, listed, and managed separately as their own participating site submission. These submissions will be available to be viewed under the Sites tab on the main study page. And just a quick note, just because there is a difference between new studies we receive, or not new studies necessarily, but new relying sites for studies approved in Bruin IRB. For migrated studies where UCLA serves as the IRB of record, we do handle them a little bit differently. pSites do not need to be created for migrated studies if the collaborator was previously reviewed and approved as an amendment in Web IRB for that study. Only new collaborators on a migrated study will be required to be listed as a pSite submission. Next slide, please. Within the pSite application, information and documentation should be provided as follows. And this isn't a fully inclusive list. This is just some of the main points that we look at during our review. We do look at everything, but these are, for the most part, what you'll be required to provide in terms of information and documentation. So under page basic site information item 4, we ask that you describe any site activities that the relying site will participate in. If they're participating in all research activities per the approved protocol, you can simply indicate all in that section. In page basic local site documents item 1, we ask that you upload the local site consent form that will be used by the relying site and is provided as part of their internal IRB review at the relying site. And as Rebecca mentioned, this will be the UCLA template with local site edits only, as applicable by their relying site per local law and local context. And we do ask that you provide a track changes copy. You can provide both a tracked and clean version if you wish, but the tracked copy is necessary for us to conduct our review and ensure that all the edits made to the consent form are only addressing local context and no more edits are made. In page local site documents item 2, we ask that you upload any local recruitment documents that will be used by the relying sites. These typically have edits to change site name or local contact information. That's okay. We ask that these also be tracked so that way we can review any changes that are made to them. And then lastly, under page local site documents, item 3, we ask that you upload the pSite supplemental form to confirm activities to be performed at this site and provide local context information. The description within this pSite supplemental form will need to conform to the UCLA IRB approved protocol as well. Additionally, relying sites may be provided a Smart IRB Flex Addendum, Smart IRB LOA Letter of Authorization, IAA or IIA to facilitate the documentation of IRB reliance. This document is usually provided to the study team early on through email, but we do ask that a partially executed documents be provided under this section for UCLA IRB review. And once we finalize the study upon full execution, our team will upload the documents under that section for maintenance and study record keeping. Next slide, please. There are a few steps that the IRB Reliance team takes to review and confirm before proceeding with the review of the pSite submission. Before we even begin our actual review of the pSite submission, we will go back to the main study to confirm that the protocol identifies the study as multi-site and collaborative, which it has to before you can create a pSite submission, as well as that the application reflects that the study was approved for UCLA to serve as the IRB of record, as well as listing the local site investigator for each pSite under item 4 of local UCLA study team members. So that way at a glance, we can see what sites our IRB committee staff has taken a look at, as well as making sure that the activities described in the pSite match with what our IRB committee staff reviewed and determined to be acceptable for our site. In Bruin IRB, a pSite submission is required to document collaboration with a relying site, not only a modification to the main study to reflect the local relying investigators, though the main study must reflect the relying site and their local PI. The UCLA study team should submit a participating site or pSite submission in Bruin IRB for each site that is requesting to rely on the UCLA IRB. After your submission, our team will process the pSite, requesting any clarification or edits that may be required before we're able to issue an initial site approval for the relying site. Please note that a condition will be listed on initial approval notices for relying sites pending their provision of their local site acknowledgement, as Rebecca noted earlier, and is also noted on slide 11, steps 5 through 7. Next slide, please. And these last couple slides provide more detail on how to navigate your Bruin IRB submission to locate existing pSite submissions that you've already created, as well as how to access UCLA IRB approved documentation for those sites. At any time, you may use the Sites tab present on the main study page to quickly review the status of each of the relying sites, including those that may be fully approved, pending UCLA IRB review, awaiting modifications that our team requested, or still in the awaiting site materials stage, which is when we're still waiting for that initial submission to be made to our site. This is the page I would advise you use to easily access pSite submissions for all sites. It is the page that, rather than going and searching under relying sites, I go into here to be able to more quickly identify any sites and access their submissions directly. And next slide, please. Additionally, there are 2 different ways you can access approved documentation related to participating sites. One version is present on the main study page, though I don't really like to use this myself because all of the documents for all sites are all crammed together and it can be quite hard to navigate, especially if some of the naming conventions for those documents within each pSites are non-specific. Instead, we advise use of the Documents tab within each respective individual pSite as pictured in the slide, as it allows the UCLA study team to easily identify and access documents specific for that site and that were approved for that site. And lastly, before we move on any further, does anyone have any questions related to the last few slides we've covered?
And Ryan, I just wanted to add, we do have, and on the resources page, there's a link to how to create a pSite submission, which is an item by item instructions manual that also includes the instructions that Ryan shared about what to do if your investigator or your institution's not listed when you create the pSite, because that's the first thing you have to identify is the investigator and the related site. So that's available to you as well.
Thanks, Rebecca. Were there any questions? Okay, thank you.
Tammy, you had a question?
Oh, did you?
Yes, I do. I think this is on the slide that you presented, though, Rebecca. I have a question about if you would just go back through those steps again once the pSite is approved and the documentation that's sent to the site initially, and whether they're able to go ahead and enroll, then they send us information back that their IRB has, in fact, reviewed everything, and we submit that as an amendment. And when do we get the stamped consent forms for them in that process?
Right. So as I was stating in that process, we would issue that as a last step um, uh, at the time we get that documentation from the local site. But in some cases, a local site won't issue their final okay to initiate the study at that site unless they have stamped consent forms. If you're working with a site that has that requirement, you just need to speak to your IRB Reliance analyst, and then they'll request approval to release the stamped consents and then add a condition to the approval. So what happens is when we have these conditions on the approvals, we put the onus on the local site PI to identify what they need to do with their local IRB office. And then they go to their local IRB office, they meet those requirements, and they get a final okay. Once they have that final okay from their local office, they're good to go. And then you're just submitting that as documentation. So they don't have to wait until that modification you create to begin enrollment at that site. Because this is just a kind of close the loop step to make sure that we have the full agreement from the site that they're good to enroll at that site. Does that address your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions on that? And we're finding not more and more, but we've had a handful of situations, particularly in collaborations with UCSF, that they won't finish their local site review until they have the stamped consent form. So we know that for a fact for UCSF. So we have worked with them and met with their Reliance team to see what they need at each point in the process. And we've adjusted our procedures so that we don't hold anything up in a back and forth catch-22. So, again, if you encounter another site that's like, no, I need the stamped consents, not just the approval notice for our site, then please let us know. Forward that email to IRB Reliance at research.ucla.edu. Or, if you're working with me or you're working with Gerard or Ryan, you can send it to us individually and we'll help you out there. So the next section talks about, okay, now your study's approved, your pSites are approved, they have an approved consent form, study's initiated. What is your responsibility? What responsibilities continue at this point? And you'll soon find here that this is where a lot of the work of management of multi-site studies happens. So Gerard's going to take us through this.
Thank you, Rebecca. Could we move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So for overall study updates, modifications impacting the overall study will be handled by the UCLA committee staff. Some examples of overall study modifications are study protocol revisions, consent form revisions, updated drug or device information, updated recruitment or consenting processes applicable to all sites, or updated safety monitoring procedures. The study team should reach out to the Reliance team to confirm how best to coordinate the communication and review of an overall study amendment with all participating sites. Next slide, please. Local site-specific updates will primarily be handled by the Reliance team. Some examples of site-specific updates can include a change in local PI, change in the UCLA-approved local site-specific consent forms, or any change in how the study will be conducted or managed at this local site. Next slide. When addressing the annual continuing review requirement, pSites can use the reporting continuing review data form as shown in this slide to report any enrollment and study updates that occurred during this review period. The sections in the form mirror the Bruin IRB CR application, so it should be familiar and will be available on the OHRPP website. Next slide. Collaborating pSites must report their accrual information to the UCLA PI. We suggest using the continuing review form as shown in the previous slide and collecting this form at the first CR reminder received in Bruin IRB, which is 90 days before the submission deadline. The UCLA IRB committee staff will process the CR per usual practices, ensuring that a summary of the research in the prior year reflects activities conducted at all participating sites. Once the CR is approved, the UCLA PI is responsible for forwarding the confirmation of continuing approval to all the sites. And to note, pSites do not require their own separate CR submissions. Next slide. For post-approval reporting, all participating sites must follow the UCLA reporting requirements, such as when the study at the local site is closed, terminated, or suspended, or if any local protocol event requires prompt reporting. Examples of required prompt reporting include possible unanticipated problems posing risks to subjects or others, possible serious and/or continuing noncompliance, or any unresolved participant complaints. The typical steps of the reporting process is as follows. The local pSite investigator provides information of the event to the UCLA PI. The UCLA PI assesses the event and the required corrective action. The UCLA PI submits a PAR in Bruin IRB, then the UCLA IRB reviews the event and makes and communicates the final determination. And lastly, the UCLA PI communicates this determination to the pSite and confirms that any corrective action was completed by the relying site. Are there any questions on this section? Okay.
I just wanted to add, Gerard, thank you so much for that presentation. That again, the pSites follow UCLA PI reporting requirements. So this is a link to that decision tree. Some of these events won't require submission of a PAR. So that decision tree is key to looking at that. So you use that decision tree. And if it's a non-reportable event, then you would summarize it as part of your annual CR like you do for any events that have non-reportable events that happen at UCLA. So we're cutting short on time here, so I'm going to move along. We had a couple of just easy questions to help enforce concepts. So I'm going to go through these quickly. I apologize. There's a lot of information today. But basically, the first scenario is you have a PI submitting a federal research grant that requires collaborations with other sites. What's your first step? And what we're hoping is that you understand from this presentation that always your first step is to collaborate with UCLA OHRPP. Generally, that's going to be your committee administrator that you normally work with. Or if you're not sure if this study will be reviewed by that committee, you can also ask IRB Reliance and we'll work together with that committee administrator. The importance here is there is not a requirement for UCLA to serve as IRB of record, even if we're the primary awardee. We have the right to decline, and we have the right to say, like, we can't handle this study based on the risk and the oversight that's required, and you need to go to Advara or WCG or Sterling or whomever and get an outside review. This C is incorrect because not only does the main protocol at UCLA have to be approved, we need to have approval for each participating site in order to address the regulatory requirements. For this next question, we're asking, you got approval, you told UCLA IRB you wanted to be the IRB of record, you have a final approval and stamped consent forms. What do you have to do? So again, you should understand that you now need to work with the Reliance team to determine how Reliance agreements will be established and initiate the steps to request local context review from each site. It's not okay. UCLA will not take those steps for you. And most importantly, it's not okay to initiate the study based on the IRB approval alone for the main study. We have to do the pSite local context review, keeping in mind that sites outside of California may have different regulatory requirements, and in order to ensure that the study is being conducted in compliance with all those requirements, we need to conduct that pSite review. And in terms of repeat studies with the same collaborators, it's important for you to understand that we agree to serve as IRB of record on a study-by-study basis. We do not have master agreements with any academic medical center, academic collaborator, university, community center to always serve as their IRB of record. It's a study-by-study basis, and we look at those same factors each time: funding, size of the study, and area of expertise. The last question has to do with reporting of a serious adverse event that occurs in a non-UCLA site. This is just emphasizing the importance that as soon as you identify a serious adverse event, either at UCLA or at a non-UCLA site for which we're responsible, it's important that the UCLA pSite communicate immediately with all sites, let them know that an event's being investigated, and that they would follow up with any corrective action. And after receiving UCLA's final determination, the UCLA lead investigator will share required action with each participating site. The important thing here is to ensure participant safety. So if it's something that can impact participant safety, we need to advise other sites as soon as possible to minimize the potential that that same event could occur at another participating site. The next slide has the resources that we referenced and how to create pSites. You also know about our webpage, which has links to all this information, as well as the Bruin IRB help page. This slide includes our website with all that information, our team member names, and our email, IRB Reliance. And then finally, just a reminder, hopefully you found this presentation helpful. We know it's a lot of work, and we appreciate your feedback on our presentation and welcome your suggestions for future presentations.